My boyfriend of 3 years chose his canvas tote bag over our relationship. I told everyone he left me for a shopping bag. What I did not tell anyone was that I gave him the ultimatum, and he was completely right. I told 40 people that my boyfriend chose a canvas bag over 3 years of love, and every single one of them eventually stopped believing me. Not because I lied about the bag. Because I lied about the ultimatum. I stood in our kitchen and I told Daniel that if he carried that tote to my cousin's wedding, I was done with us, and he looked at me for a long moment and said okay, picked up the bag, and walked out. I spent the next 2 weeks telling everyone he had left me over a bag. What I did not tell anyone was that I had made him choose. What I did not tell anyone was that when he chose correctly. And what I did not tell anyone was that the reason I gave him that ultimatum had nothing to do with the bag and everything to do with a fear so specific and so shameful that I would rather burn my relationship to the ground than say it out loud. I said it out loud eventually. In front of people I could not take it back from. And by then the damage was the kind you do not recover from, the kind that does not just end a relationship but ends the version of yourself you had been performing for 3 years and leaves you alone in a kitchen with the accurate version, which is considerably less flattering. Daniel was an environmental engineer. Canvas tote bag, reusable water bottle, 4 years without a plastic cup, the whole committed picture. I knew all of this when we met. I had found it attractive when we met, the specific attractiveness of a person who believes in something enough to make it structural in their daily life. The bag had been part of him on our first date, on our 100th, on every ordinary Tuesday in between. It was not new information. It was not a surprise. The bag had been there the entire time, and I had not minded the bag until my cousin Rachel sent a wedding invitation and I started thinking about walking into a room full of my extended family with a man carrying a worn canvas conference tote and feeling the specific dread of a woman who has spent her entire life managing what her family thinks of her choices. That was the real problem. Not the bag. Me. My family. The measuring system they applied to everything, and the fact that I had been living inside that measuring system for so long that I had stopped being able to separate their opinion of my life from my own. Daniel did not know this. I had never told him. I had presented myself for 3 years as someone who was unbothered by external judgment, and I had been performing that person so consistently that I had almost believed it myself, and then the wedding invitation had arrived and the performance had started cracking, and instead of showing Daniel the crack, I had picked up the bag and pointed at it and called it the problem. 2 weeks before the wedding I said casually, the way you test things before you commit to them, that he probably was not planning to bring the tote, right? He said he had been planning to. He said he needed somewhere to carry the card and the gift and his phone. I said he could use pockets. He said his suit did not have adequate pockets. I said he could get a different bag. He looked at me and said the tote was fine. I said the tote was not formal. He said tote bags were neutral. I said, Daniel, it has a conference logo on it. He said, it's a climate conference logo. I said, that is not better. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before and said he would think about it, and I heard that as agreement and moved on. He had not heard it as agreement. 1 week before the wedding I brought it up again. Less casual. I said I needed him to use a different bag. He asked why the bag specifically. I said because the family was formal and the bag was not. He said he had a messenger bag. I said the messenger bag was also not right. He said, what is the actual problem here? I said the problem was presentation. He said, whose presentation? I said ours. He looked at me and said, you're embarrassed by me. I said I was not embarrassed by him. I was concerned about the occasion. He said, the bag is part of who I am. You know that. I said I knew that, and I was asking him to set it aside for one afternoon. He said he was not comfortable setting himself aside for an afternoon to pass a test administered by people who had not yet met him. And then he said the thing that cracked the performance completely open, what are you actually afraid of? I did not answer that question. I changed the subject. I moved into logistics and then into dinner and then into the ordinary business of an evening, and the question sat in the corner of the kitchen unanswered where it had always been and where I had always made sure it stayed. He did not push. He was patient in the way he was always patient, which was the patience of someone who understood that a person would get there when they got there and that pushing did not help them get there faster. I had taken his patience for granted for 3 years. I did not understand until much later that patience has a floor. The Thursday conversation happened 3 days before the wedding. I sat him down and I said I needed to be completely clear about how important this was to me. He said he was listening. I said if he carried that bag to the wedding I needed him to understand it would be a problem for us. He said what kind of problem? I said a serious one. He said, are you giving me an ultimatum about a tote bag? I said I was being clear about my needs. He said, that is an ultimatum about a tote bag. I said it was about respect for something that mattered to me. He said, the bag matters to me. You have not respected that. I said that was different. He said, how? I did not have an answer. He said he was going to take some time to think and he went to the bedroom and closed the door. He was in there for 3 hours. I sat in the living room for 3 hours waiting for him to come out with the right answer, which was that the bag would stay home and we would go to the wedding and the family would meet him and everything would be fine. He came out at 11 at night and he sat across from me and he said, "I've thought about it." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm not going to leave the bag at home." I said, "Then we have a problem." He said, "I know." I said, "What does that mean?" He said it meant he understood this was serious and he had decided anyway and he was sorry. He stood up and picked up the bag from the counter and he put it on his shoulder and he said, "I'm sorry it came to this. I really am." And he walked out. I sat on the couch and waited. He did not come back. At midnight I called Priya. I told her Daniel had left. She asked what had happened. I told her he had chosen the bag over our relationship. She said, "What?" I said he had literally walked out with the bag. She said she was so sorry. She said that was unbelievable. She said, "Who does that?" And I let her say all of it. I let her be outraged on my behalf. I did not tell her about the ultimatum. I did not tell her about the 3 hours he had spent thinking about it. I did not tell her about what are you actually afraid of. I told her my boyfriend had chosen a canvas tote over 3 years of love and I let the story be exactly that simple and exactly that incomplete. That story lasted 9 days. On day 3 I had told 12 people. The message was clean and devastating in the way of stories that contained just enough truth to survive initial scrutiny. The sympathy was real. The group chat was full of disbelief about a man who had ended a relationship over an accessory. Nobody had the other information. I did not give anyone the other information. I sat inside the story and felt it hold me up the way false things hold you up, which is with a temporary structural integrity that feels stable until the actual weight arrives. On day 5 Priya called and said she had run into Daniel at the coffee place near his office. I said okay. She said he seemed okay. She said they had talked for a few minutes. I said what had they talked about? She said the breakup. I said what had he said? She was quiet for a moment. She said, he mentioned an ultimatum. I said the situation was more complicated than that word implied. She said, was there an ultimatum? I said I had been very clear about what I needed. She said, that is not what I asked. I said, Priya, she said, was there an ultimatum? I said yes. There was a silence on the phone that was the specific silence of someone recalibrating everything they had said in the previous 5 days and deciding what to do with the recalibration. She said, okay. I think you need to get ahead of this because it's going to come out and it's better if it comes from you. I said I would think about it. I did not get ahead of it. It came out anyway. On day 9 my cousin Rachel, whose wedding had started everything, called me. She said she had heard from someone who had heard from someone and she needed to ask me directly whether there had been an ultimatum. I said there had been a serious conversation about needs. She said, did you tell him it was over if he brought the bag? I said I had expressed how important it was. She said, to her wedding. That I invited both of you to. You gave him an ultimatum about an accessory for my wedding. The way she said it, with the specific flatness of someone seeing something clearly that had been obscured until that moment, told me the story had reached the point where my version of it was no longer the version that would survive. That night the group chat changed. Jaya posted something careful and factual that contained the word ultimatum. The chat went quiet for 6 minutes. And then Mira said, wait. And then Rohan said, an ultimatum over a tote bag? And then Jaya said, he's an environmental engineer. The bag is basically his professional identity. And then Priya, who had known for 4 days and had been sitting with it, said, I think there's more to this story. And I watched it happen in real time on my phone in my kitchen, the story I had built over 9 days dismantling itself in a group chat in approximately 40 minutes. I put my phone face down. I did not pick it up for 2 hours. When I picked it up there were 14 unread messages, and a missed call from my mother and the specific knowledge that my mother did not call to comfort me. She called to ask me a direct question and she led with it the way she led with everything important, without preamble, without softening. She said, did you give that boy an ultimatum over a bag? I said the situation was nuanced. She said, I did not ask about the situation. I asked about the ultimatum. I said yes. She said, over a canvas bag. I said it was about more than the bag. She said, then why didn't you say what it was about? I did not answer. She said, I'll tell you why. Because what it was actually about was you being afraid of what your aunts would think and you knew that if you said that out loud it would sound exactly like what it is, which is you letting other people's opinions cost you a good man. I said, Mum, she said, I'm not finished. You then told everyone a story that left out the most important part. Do you understand what that cost you? I said I was beginning to understand. She said, you're not beginning. You're arriving. There's a difference. I posted in the group chat the next morning. Not the managed version. The real one. I said I owed everyone a more complete account. I said there had been an ultimatum, and I had not included that when I first told the story because I had been embarrassed and not thinking clearly about what I was sharing. I said the ultimatum had been about the bag at Rachel's wedding specifically. I said I understood it looked different with that information. I said I was sorry for the incomplete version. 14 people read it. 11 responded. The responses were decent in the way of people who are trying to be kind while also processing something that has complicated their previous sympathy. Priya said she appreciated me saying something. Jaya said she was glad I had clarified. Rohan said nothing in the chat and called me instead and said, without cruelty, that he thought the ultimatum had been a bit much and that Daniel was a good person and he hoped I was okay. I said I was working on it. He said he knew. Daniel's response in the chat was 4 words. He said, "Take care everyone," and left the group. Not dramatically. Just left. Clean and complete and without a single word directed at me or at the story or at any of it. The 4 words and the leaving were the most dignified thing in the entire thread, and I had not been the one to do either of them, and the contrast was its own verdict on the previous 9 days. I needed to understand what had actually happened, so I called Priya and asked her to be honest with me, the kind of honest that costs something, the kind I had not been with anyone for 9 days. She came over that afternoon and sat across from me at the kitchen table where Daniel had sat 3 hours on a Thursday deciding what he was going to do, and she said, "Do you know why you actually gave him the ultimatum?" I said I thought I did. She said, "Say it out loud." I said I had been afraid of my family's judgment. She said, "More specific." I said I had been afraid they would see the bag and see someone who did not fit the image of a successful partner and that their judgment would become my judgment, and I had not been able to separate the two. Priya looked at me for a moment and said, "You have been afraid of your family's opinion for as long as I have known you and you have never once said that to Daniel." I said no. She said, "So he has been with someone for 3 years who was afraid of something that directly affected him and he was never told." I said yes. She said, "And then when it came to a point of crisis you gave him an ultimatum instead of telling him the truth." I said yes. She said, "That's the story." I said I knew. She said, "The bag is not the story." I said I knew that too. I reached out to Daniel 2 weeks after he left. Not to ask him to come back. To say what I should have said in the kitchen on the Thursday instead of the ultimatum. I wrote it in a message because I could not trust my voice to stay steady on the phone and I needed to say it completely without being interrupted. I said I had been afraid of my family's judgment and had made the bag the target of that fear instead of naming the fear. I said he had been right that the bag and the values were not separable and that asking him to separate them had been asking him to perform a version of himself that was not him. I said I was sorry for the ultimatum and I was sorrier for the 9 days of incomplete story. I said the incomplete story had been cowardice and I own it. He responded 4 days later. He said he appreciated me saying it. He said he had known something else was underneath the bag conversation and had not been able to reach it and had eventually understood that he could not reach what I was not willing to show him. He said he had not left because of the bag. He had left because the ultimatum had told him something about how I saw him and what I was willing to ask him to sacrifice for my comfort, and he had not been able to stay inside that understanding. He said he hoped I was okay. He said the bag was still fine, which surprised a laugh out of me that was also adjacent to crying. And then he said one more thing. He said, "For what it's worth, my family thought you were great. I never asked you to be different for them." I read that sentence 6 times. I put my phone down. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. His family had never asked me to be different. I had asked him to be different for mine. And then I had told everyone he had chosen a bag over love when what he had actually chosen was himself over a version of himself I had decided was more acceptable than the real one. Rachel's wedding happened. I went alone. I walked into the room full of extended family and I smiled and answered questions, and nobody asked about Daniel because by then the accurate version of events had completed its journey through the family network and the questions that might have been asked had already been answered in the traveling. My aunt found me during the cocktail hour. She was 73 and had been married twice and had the specific authority of someone who has failed at important things and learned from the failing. She said, "The engineer." I said yes. She said, "Sounds like he had his head on straight." I said he did. She said, "Men who know who they are and carry it with them are rare." I said I knew. She said, "Your grandmother was like that. People tried to make her smaller her whole life and she never let them." She patted my arm and moved on, and I stood in the cocktail hour of my cousin's wedding and thought about a man who had known who he was and carried it with him everywhere and whom I had tried to make smaller for one afternoon and who had said no. He had said no. And he had been right. The group chat found its rhythm again after a few weeks. I was still in it. The space where Daniel had been was present the way absences are present when what was there mattered. Priya and I were okay. Jaya and I were okay. The friendship survived because I had eventually told the honest version, and honest versions are survivable in a way that dishonest ones are not, because dishonest ones require maintenance, and the maintenance breaks down, and when it breaks down, it takes everything it was holding up with it. I think about the Thursday. The 3 hours he spent in that bedroom. I used to think about it as the 3 hours before he made the wrong decision. Now I think about it as the 3 hours a person who knew himself spent deciding whether to compromise that knowledge for someone who was asking him to. He decided not to. The decision was correct. The decision was the most honest thing that happened in the entire sequence of events, and it was not my decision. It was his. And he made it without anger and without a counter-manipulation and without a story told to other people that left out the most important part. He made it, and he picked up the bag, and he said he was sorry, and he left, and he said take care everyone, and he was done. I'm still learning how to be done with things the way he was done with them. Clean. Honest. Without a 9-day story that falls apart in a group chat. Here is what I want to say to anyone reading this who recognizes the shape of it. Not the tote bag. The thing underneath the tote bag. The fear you have been carrying that you attached to something visible because the actual fear was too honest to name. The ultimatum you gave over the symbol because giving it over the real thing would have required you to say what the real thing was. The story you told afterward that left out the part that changes the meaning. Name the fear. Before the ultimatum. Say it out loud to the person who deserves to hear it. Say I am afraid of what my family thinks, and I know that is my problem to manage and not yours to perform around. Say it before you stand in a kitchen with an ultimatum. Before you watch someone pick up a bag and say I'm sorry it came to this. Before you spend 9 days in a story that was never true. Because the person who knows who they are and carries it with them everywhere is not going to set it down for your fear. They are going to pick it up. And walk out. And they are going to be right. And you are going to spend a long time in a kitchen understanding that. I know. I am still in the kitchen. And the bag was never the problem. I was. And the most honest thing in the whole story was the person who carried it anyway. And left.